Shalom. Again, we're meeting. This is the last Parsha in the book of Bereshit. The Parsha's name is Veyachi, speaking of the fact that he lived. Now, in our story today, I want to begin by doing the beginning and the ending, but in between, I want to talk about some of the sons, not all of them, of Jacob, and the blessings that he was giving them in our Parsha this week. To begin, let's go to chapter number 47, and let's look at verse number 28, which is the first verse of the group. Now remember, in the last Parsha, each Parsha is connected to the one before it. The last verse that you're going to see is 27, which said, "Thus Israel settled." Now remember, they came down to sojourn, but in the process, they settled in rather than left. So they settled in the land of Egypt in the region of Goshen, and they acquired. This is where the sojourn ends, and this is where the settling begins. They acquired property in it, and they were fruitful, and they multiplied greatly. So great success was found by them. But now it says, "And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. In the days of Jacob, the years of his life were 147 years. Now in our story then, we're finding out that Jacob will have lived 17 years in the land. So instead of sojourning, he's now been a part of the land. Now we understand that these last 17 years were good. Well, there's a lot of understandings in that. Remember that Joseph, again, his beloved son, was taken from him when he was 17 years old. For 17 years, he will be missing. And now for 17 years, Jacob will be happy and content in where he's at. So we get an idea that 17 is important. You also should understand that if you were to read the Hebrew side of that verse, you'll find out that there are 17 words. 17 in Hebrew has a gematria, or a numerical value, or can make a word with a numeric value of 17, and that word is tov, which is good. So over and over again, we see that there were some hints that were given from the very beginning. But I also want you to look over on that Hebrew side, and I want you to notice that this last Parsha is called a Closed Parsha. Now by Closed Parsha, by Closed Parsha, what I mean is that between the Parsha before it and this Parsha, there are no breaks. It's a continuous Parsha. If you go back and look at the previous ones, you'll find that there's basically a nine blank spaces, or places where a word could have fit between each of the two Parshas. But this one is a closed one. And so the rabbis and the sages, when they began to think about it, tried to come up with an understanding. Well, why is this one closed? What's different about this than it was before? Well, in Bereshit Rabbah 96:1, it says, "Because the eyes and heart of Israel will soon be closed." Now, the idea here is multiple, but the concept is the fact that as we're looking at this, we have to understand that something is going to close the eyes of the people and their hearts. And that came from the verse previous, when they no longer sojourned, but they began to settle. Soon they're going to be so comfortable where they are that what will happen, well, we already know the story of what will happen. You see, Jacob will be 190, will die, and there'll be 193 years afterwards in which Abraham's prophecy that they would be in a foreign land, aliens, would begin to really kick in. And so in that period of time, Israel found itself walking into slavery. Now, Jacob originally, when we go through this, attempted to tell his sons what it would be like at the end of days. Now, in the beginning of this concept of telling us what it's like at the end of these days, the Shekinah, the holy presence of God, that portion of God which tells the secrets, well, that left him. And so it was closed. The door was no longer open according to Pesakim 58a or 56a. Originally, what will be happening in those days, that's what he's going to talk about. So let's slip over to chapter 49 and take a look at what's going on in that particular place and time. So here we go. It says, then Jacob called for his sons and said, assemble yourselves, and I will tell you what will befall you at the end of days. Assemble yourselves. So they're coming from multiple places. They're gathering before Jacob. He's lying on his deathbed. And at this point in time, he wants to tell them something. But we saw that in telling them, he couldn't. Now it appears as though they left. And in leaving, as they go, all of a sudden he calls them back. Because it says, now gather yourselves and listen, O sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. So there's two characters speaking. One is the old Jacob, one is the new Israel. So he's going to give them some information that regarding the information or the blessings that he'll give come from olden times or times in which they've, in the past. And now Israel is about to tell them their future, or not really tell them their future, but hint at their future. And so as we look at this, then we're looking at something that is very, very different than what he wanted to tell them. Because you see, the end of days was at least 3,500 years away. So it was not about the days at the end, because if he would have even told them about that, how would they have reacted? What would have happened because of that? Could they have held themselves together for 3,500 years? Or how many of them would just simply have, oh, well, that's for somebody else to worry about? You see, some of the things that we think about and do is because we don't know the future. We don't know when we're going to die. We don't know if we're going to get in an automobile accident. We have no clue as to what's going on. But to know something that's 3,500 years away doesn't make sense. Now, the Zohar, when it talks about Exodus chapter 15, verse 17, tells us that Israel had been worthy, according to God, to be brought into the end of days sooner as they were coming out of the land. But we know the story. They were worthy, but they became unworthy. So he's now given them an understanding that this is what they're going to talk about. But notice how he begins. Now there's 12 sons, and he's going to give each of the 12, because earlier he had given this Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. He had given them an understanding. But now he's going to give each of the 12 sons, his 12 real sons, although Ephraim and Manasseh, many say that had Reuben not moved the marriage bed of Jacob out of the tent of Bilhah, he would have had 2 more sons that night. She would have produced for him Ephraim and Manasseh, which is one of the reasons why they think that he, at that point in time, made them his sons. But that's for another story. Verse 3, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, my initial vigor, foremost in rank, and the foremost in power, water-like impetuosity. You cannot be foremost because you mounted your father's bed, and then you desecrated him who ascended my couch. Doesn't sound much like a blessing. But yet, if we go to chapter or the same chapter and look at verse number 27 or number 28, notice what it says. All of these are the tribes of Israel, 12. And this is what their father spoke to them, and he blessed them. He blessed each according to an appropriate blessing. So there is a blessing in here for him. But let's go on. Notice the next one. Here in this one, he blesses two brothers. Simeon and Levi are comrades, or brothers is another way of putting it. Their weaponry is a stolen craft. Into their conspiracy may my soul never not enter, and with their congregation do not join. O my honor, for in their rage they murdered people, and at their whim they hamstrung an ox. Now, in our story then, Rashi tells us, well, there's supposedly a blessing there. What was it? Because I didn't hear it directly from either of those two sets of blessings that he gave. But we have to understand that he wrote it in Hebrew, and so the blessings would have been Hebraic. Rashi noted that this is a poetic language that he's writing, that these are verses as opposed to simply writing simple sentences. Now, as we look through this, we have to see the fact that there's several things going on. First character he wrote about was Reuben. Reuben means the son who can see. Now, you remember way back in the beginning when Reuben was created, which is back in chapter number 29. And we look at the verse where Leah conceived, and which is in verse 32. It says, Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, as she had declared, because Hashem has discerned my humiliation, for now my husband will love me. She called his name Reuben, the son that he could see. You see, remember Jacob, when he originally married, he thought he was marrying Rachel. And when he went into the tent, he thought he was going into the tent with Rachel. When he found out it was Leah, there was a struggle. And so Leah appeared to be on the outs at the same time. And so therefore she was, I wouldn't say, I don't have a good word for what she must have been feeling. But anyway, she wanted to know, she gave the idea, or Rashi gave the idea that she wanted him to see the difference in my son, and the difference between him and my mother-in-law's son. Well, Rashi notes that the other son, the mother-in-law's son, was Esau. I want you to see the difference between Reuben and Esau. Now, she does this as a way of identifying what's going on. What will happen is they're both going to be very much alike, because Esau and Reuben both will lose the rights of the firstborn. They'll react differently, which is what I think Leah's hinting at, even though she doesn't say it directly. Because you see, it'll be out of sight. It'll be something that he wants to be aware of. Now, Reuben should have been named by his father. The father names the first, the mother names the second. Then after that, the names can be desired father could do it or the mother. But the first one's always named by the father. And Reuben wasn't named by the father. Reuben was named by Leah. So you understand why Leah at this point in time seems very, very upset. Now she had born the first one. Now in this first child that she reared, his position was one of, as it goes back to 49, notice what it says, you're my firstborn, my Bechor. Now, when you're the firstborn, you have certain advantages, which he did for a period of time. He did have some advantages. And again, the idea is that she's hoping he will realize what's now happening. Because remember, prophetically, he's supposed to have 12 children. And how is he going to have 12 children? We know that Rachel was infertile, much like her mother-in-law was. And now she's beginning to produce children, and he wants him to realize what's going on, the potential that's going on in that. And so the prophecies are beginning to happen. Now, the idea of vigor was that the first night, which is a night when they commit to one another, but according to Yevavot 38 or 34a, the woman does not conceive on that night, but yet at this point in time, that's exactly what happened. She conceived on the very first night. Now, there were other exceptions, and they were significant. Judah had a one-night tryst with a prostitute who turned out to be his daughter-in-law, Tamar, in which the child that was born would eventually become, Peretz, would become a progenitor of the Mashiach. So there are some very important things to understand here. Now, we remind ourselves as we're going through this, that it goes on to say, if you're looking, it says, foremost in rank, foremost in power. As first in line, he had the power of the group. He commanded them. But he was water-like, impetuous. One thing you can understand about water is that you have a terrible time keeping it in one place, unless you have it in a glass or something where it's in a riverbank, whatever. But this particular thing talks about you cannot foremost because you mounted your father's bed. Again, the idea, you can't. In other words, the water is not the water in a cup. The water is something that can spill, it can move, it can splash, it can go in all directions. That's the idea of water. Reuben was impetuous. He would move quickly. One of those things that he did was, way back in the book of Genesis, was after the death of Rachel, Jacob moved his bed, not into the tent of Leah, Reuben's mother, but into the tent of Bilhah, Rachel's concubine, or what it would have been his third wife. And so when he moves the bed out, it talks about mounting the bed. And by mounting the bed, it goes on to say, he desecrated who ascended my couch or ascended my bed. The character he's talking about is the Shekinah, God. The presence of God left that tent at that moment in time of that bed. He desecrated, in his essence, God's presence. And so for that, although it doesn't say it here, but we read about it earlier, he loses the right of the firstborn. That will end up with Joseph and the coat of many colors. So our first look at this story then is, we have a character who is recognized as the firstborn, but who is impetuous and finds himself moving in an uncontrollable fashion and losing the right of the firstborn. Now, he forfeits power, he forfeits position. Now, the word here for water or for impetuous is actually a noun. And it means vain and reckless. So we know what kind of water that he's actually talking about. And in the story, as we go through this, I want to share a section with you from what's called the Humash. The Humash is a 5-book, the first 5 books, the Torah, plus a commentary that goes with it. And I want you to see something from the comment, or hear something from the commentary if you don't have it. In my art scroll, it's page 190 and 191. That's where we're at. And what we're talking about is a word. You see, the concept here is the fact that it's pchaz, Fe, Het, Zain. Now, Reuben's actions were reckless, pchaz. And so as we look at this Torah, at this particular section, we begin to understand what's going on, because he begins to tell us Reuben's heir and partial vindication. After Rachel's death, Jacob established his primary residence in the tent of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant. Reuben considered this an affront to his mother Leah, saying, if my mother's sister, Rachel, was my mother's rival, should the handmaiden of my mother's sister now be my mother's rival? To defend his mother's honor, Reuben took it upon himself to move Jacob's bed to Leah's tent. This is all transpiring according to Shabbos 55b. Nevertheless, Scripture describes it as starkly as Reuben had sinned grievously. This follows the dictum of even minor transgressions of great people. You see, Reuben is still a righteous man. The standards for righteous people is different than the standards for the average person, and obviously different from those who willfully sin. You see, even the smallest infractions draw what we would call rebuke, which is exactly what we see here, is rebuke. So as he goes through this story, then we have to understand that he is being punished by a very, very difficult standard, a standard which nobody can, the standard which most people cannot achieve. Now, as he goes through this idea, we understand that he himself is, pchaz. Now, in the book of NETIV 9a, which is another of the Talmudic books, we have this same word, and the meaning of the word is the idea of rising up. In pchaz, there is a reckless person. Pigazon is one who is in a hurry. All come from the same root, the same pei, het, and zain. That's the root of these words. All of those speak of an action, an unthought of action. Now, as we're going through the story, we looked at the second 2 characters, and they were grouped together. And the reason they were grouped together is because they suffered from the same unrighteous act in Jacob's understanding. So the next 2 sons are Simeon, which means to see, and Levi, which means to join to or to attach to. So we're now looking at the second and third sons, because you remember those 2 brothers, according to our story, were comrades, right? Comrades or brothers. Well, they were brothers, but the brothers here indicates agreement. These 2 people were in agreement. And a stolen craft. Now, the question is, what's the stolen craft? Is there conspiracy? May my soul not enter with the congregation, do not join my honor. Why? For in their rage, they murdered people. So the craft that they were talking about was the craft of the weapon, the idea of causing death. That was the craft of Esau. Again, we see a slight comparison Jacob makes of his older sons, his first three sons. All of them have a flaw. The flaw produces for Jacob what appears to be rebuke. In other words, he's coming to them, he's talking to them, and the purpose of his conversations is to remind them of what they've done wrong. And there's a reason for it, which I hope to get to in a little bit. So anyway, we go back to the story. Now, as we read through the sections on Simeon and Levi, there really isn't anything that we can hang our hat on to say that there's a blessing there. So we're going to have to read between the lines. Some have chosen to understand that the blessing that he says is with the fact that their actions were to rescue Dinah, which he couldn't be a part of, which he wanted to have no credit in, but it was something that would honor their family by removing her from the hands of the Canaanites. Now, as we go through this story, we also understand that Jacob steers away from cursing his sons by saying, accursed is their rage. In other words, he doesn't curse them, he curses the rage that they have within them. Why does he do that? Well, because of Joseph, they're going to be separated out. And so they can't be together. Notice it talks about the fact that they were together, they were joined, they were brothers, they were comrades. Now, when Moses finishes his blessing, it will sound much like what Jacob has done. And in doing that, what we'll find is that Moses will commit to separating these two. Now we know they're already going to be separated because Levi is going to be the priestly tribe, and they're going to have 48 cities. They do not get a parcel of land; they get cities that they dwell in. At the same time, Simeon, he leaves as a very large group from Egypt. But along the way, you remember there's the story at Pia where Cosbi and the Moabite women, actually the tribe of Simeon and the Moabite women, begin to cohabit, bringing a plague upon the people, in which Pinchas from the tribe of Levi will settle it by stabbing Cosbi and Zimri, ending the plague. Although for the rest of the time, Pinchas will be viewed by the Simeonites, and maybe even others, as being a murderer because he killed a prince. But we also have to notice something else. Simeon and Levi are comrades, and their weaponry is a stolen craft. Now, the word for weaponry here is Hamas, the same word used to describe the Palestinian group that brings disaster and punishment and pain wherever they go. And so in our understanding then, Simeon would be seen as an aggressor. So would Levi have been seen as an aggressor. Now remember, Simeon, and at this time Zimri, goes before Moses and he says, what do you think of me with this woman who was a Moabite? You have a Moabite or Midianite wife. Can you deny me one? Well, the concept is that he was moving towards idolatry. and taking with him the tribe of Simeon. And so the plague ended because of what Pinchas had done. Both men, both Levi and Simeon, according to Rashi, possess what's called Gevurah. Gevurah is this all-consuming impact on his soul. Emotionally, I would call him a hothead because he allowed that emotion to cloud his understanding, to push him in a direction. One who has Gevurah, one who has this might, this strength, needs to have opposite it, Hesed, loving kindness. And between the two, they balance each other out, Tefret. But it appears as though Simeon does not have that. And so that's part of the discussion that his father has with him, your unbridled passion. With their congregations that are not to be joined then, Moses will end up causing Simeon's tribe, we'll call it, will find themselves mixed in with the tribes of Judah. In fact, they'll be at the southern end of the area that was given to Judah. Many of their teachers, or many of their men, will become school teachers, and therefore they will be traveling. Therefore there's no real home for them. There's no property that was guaranteed to them. Now, in our story, remember, way back in the selling away of Joseph, it says a rather interesting thing. Yes, it's in verse number 6. It says, into their conspiracy may my soul not enter. With their congregation do not join. Oh, my honor. For in their rage, they murder people, and in their whim, they hamstrung an ox. Now, we're never told that they hamstrung an ox. The word for ox is shear. It's also the same word for a bull. It's also the word, the constellation, that's used to describe Joseph. Now remember, originally, they wanted to kill Joseph when he arrived, but they were turned away from that by Reuben and Judah, and instead sold him, hamstrung him into captivity. And so as we go through our story then, we're beginning to look at that whole concept. Now, in Deuteronomy 33:17, Joseph is compared to a bull, to an ox. So the idea was that they hamstrung him, they maimed him, but they didn't kill him. And so the two dreams that Joseph had with the grain sheaves, and then for the one with the planets, both of those dreams would eventually come true. Now that we've finished these first 3 men, I want to tell you that we didn't see a whole lot of blessings, but I also want to tell you that there were blessings, because you see, the word for rebuke can also be a blessing. And this is how. If you go to Proverbs 3:12, you read the sentence that says, for he who God loves, he rebukes. So when Jacob is rebuking his 3 older sons, he does it not just to be angry and mean and cantankerous. He's doing it in love. In other words, his attempt is, at this point, is to change the behavior of his sons, to tip them off in the fact that they're going in the wrong direction, and this is the right way to go. That's what he's attempting to do. So as we go through this then, David is working, well, actually not David. Jacob is working on parenting skills, even all the way up to death. David should have read this chapter because David had the greatest difficulty rebuking or disciplining his children. And it started from the very first child, Amnon. Remember, Amnon was the character who raped his stepsister, Absalom's sister. No consequences. Absalom took it into his own hands. Absalom created a party, invited Amnon to the party, and killed him. The result was David found out and nothing happened. And it led to, later on, we see, when now he finds himself running from Absalom, who attempts to usurp his throne. Now, going on, Absalom, we know, will die. And Solomon will be given the throne. Well, actually, he almost doesn't get the throne. Remember, Adonijah, he attempts to usurp the throne by creating his own fan party, which he brings to Hebron in order to, well, make it so that he himself is seen as that one. So here we go. Adonijah, then, no consequence. If it wasn't for Bathsheba going to David and telling David and getting the promise from David and then orchestrating Absalom's coronation. Oh, by the way, Absalom was only 12 years old at the time. He hadn't even reached bar mitzvah yet, and he already became king. Well, the ideas are that, well, let's go back this way. There's a term in the Chabad movement called Hasidut. Hasidut is about a movement. It's about binding the body and the soul together into a very singular unit. They give it this term because the glue that's going to hold the body and the soul together is called Torah. And so a great deal of effort was put into it. It wasn't until about the 18th century when the Baal Shem Tov came to the conclusion and began to teach Torah in the Zohar, not amongst the rich and not amongst the scholars. He went to the people and he began to teach the people once again, because you see, Torah had become something that belonged to a special group, not to everybody. And so Baal Shem Tov began to turn a movement. This movement later became the Chabad movement. But the idea was that there was two levels of blessings, or two levels of understanding. The first level was called the normal explicit communication. In other words, it's the kind of language that we would use today in talking between us. But there's a higher level. That was the level where what we would say the elite actually worked. And it remained concealed from everybody. And how did they conceal it? In harsh criticism. In other words, you had to dig through the words, dig through the rebuke in order to find that nugget that was in there. Well, the Baal Shem Tov didn't use negative words all the time, but they were part of what he was sharing with them. So as we look at these first three men, we have to understand this is about a hidden blessing. This is about doing something on a higher level. Because you see, the next nine, their blessings are easily found. You don't have to work at it. But again, if you were to go through what the Zohar calls the four worlds, the world of Asiyah, that's the world we live in. That's the world we call reality. The next world is called Yetzirah. That's what we call the world of angels. It's the formation. It's the beginning of descending into this world that we're in. Above that is the world of Beriah. That's the throne world. That's the world of God and his throne and heaven and all of those other things. But above that is the world of Atzilut. It's the world of emanation. It's the world of words where they've not formed into anything yet. They're just there. And so as we're looking at this story, we're looking at something that's in Atzilut. It's emanating. It's coming to the people through the words that he's using, but it's still hidden in the dialogue. Now it says in this idea in Job, he says it in 5:17. Eliphaz actually gives him this advice. Happy is the man whom God afflicts. Do not despise the Almighty's discipline. So Jacob was giving discipline to his 3 older sons. The idea was that God, the God who brings love, the God who is love, will oftentimes use rebuke with the righteous, the higher righteous. And it is up to them to understand that this criticism is for their good. You and I, if we've had kids, know that there's a point in time when we have to demonstrate rebuke, affliction, whatever words you want to use, rectification. The idea is that they begin to properly criticize. That's the word I guess I would really like to use. Properly criticize in order to strengthen their character. Forgive me, I can't remember the name of the source, but the Shimon Bar Yochai, in one of his stories, was talking to his son, Eliezer. And he said to his son, he wanted him to go to 2 specific sages. And so he went to the 2 sages, and Shimon wanted to know, or wanted blessings from each of the 2 sages. What caught the eye of Eliezer, or his ear, is the fact that they both had the same blessing. And when he got back to his father, and his father says, did they say something to you? And he says, yes, they did. And he says, well, did he give you a blessing? Or did they give you a blessing? He said, well, yeah. Well, what was it? It says you shall sow, but you won't reap. How can that be good? That sounds like you're wasting your effort. To which Shimon Bar Yochai said to his son, he says, no, that's a blessing. What he's saying is, I will sow children, and I will not have to reap. I will not have to witness any of them die. Now, how do you get that from that? It's the hiddenness of the story. That's what's going on. It's the hiddenness. So we begin to talk about 3 characters. Reuben, who's given a name by his mother to see. He is about the firstborn. He is about the brilliance of daylight, first light of day, the Zohar. He's about the idea of first fruits. He's about the moment of creation, energy, great amounts of energy. Now, it's also like water. Unless you channel the energy, unless you channel the water, it's impetuous. It goes everywhere. Reuben, you have to control your water. He said to Simeon, you're capable of anger, uncontrolled anger. Your blessing will be you'll learn how to control your anger. For the tag-along Levi, he will learn to join, not with his brother in anger, he will learn to join God. You see, he is going to be the one who runs the priestly clan. Each and every one of them is going to have a place. Now, I want to again move back to the idea of 49:28. It says, all these are the tribes of Israel, 12 of them. And it goes on to say, and this is what their father spoke to them, and he blessed them. He blessed each according to his appropriate blessing. So they all got a blessing. Now, the word for blessing is Baruch. Now, the word Baruch is used 3 times. It totals, the number is 666. Well, actually, the word Baruch and the word rebuke is 666, because that's the value of that. But if you take the 3 names of the 3 sons, again, I go back to remind you, when the Torah was written, the scholars themselves understood the letters and numbers of each word. And so they began already casting ideas numerically as well as linguistically. Now, if you take the value of the 3 names of the 3 sons, you'll find out that the value of their names was 777. Now, the value of Baruch and rebuke is 666. In other words, each integer is smaller than the whole. Now, if you take that 777 and you divide it by 3, by the 3 men, the average number is 259. That's the name of Reuben. That's the value of his name. So as we go through this, then, there's a mathematical understanding as well as a linguistic understanding. I want to end today with the end of the Parsha, and I want you to go to the last chapter, chapter 50, and I want you to go to verse 24 and verse 25. It says, Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely remember you and bring you up out of the land to the land that he had sworn to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. Then Joseph adjured the children of Israel, saying, when God will indeed remember you, then you must bring my bones up out of here. Joseph understood that when he died, unlike his father, he would never be able to be taken back to the land, that Pharaoh would bury him. And actually, Pharaoh put him after embalming him, put him into a metal case and put him in the Nile River, because the Pharaoh understood that Joseph was a miracle and he would keep the waters rising in the Nile River each and every year. So he was not about to let Joseph leave the land. And so Joseph has now talking with his brothers. Joseph is the first of the 12 to die. A lot can be made of that. In fact, the rabbis spend a good deal of time talking about that very idea. In Soda 13b, they come up with some understandings or ideas of why Joseph had to die first. The first one they come up with is he was putting on airs, or he was acting superior to the others. Remember, all the way through his life, he saw himself as superior to his brothers. A righteous man is a humble man, does not put himself above the others, which is one of the thoughts as to why he needed to die early. Another idea was the fact that he embalmed his father Jacob. Remember, Jews don't embalm. They just simply bury them, and so they can decompose. The third thought was that Joseph said nothing when his brother Judah came to him, and when he was talking about his father Jacob, referred to Jacob as Joseph's servant. Jacob was not Joseph's servant. Well, the fourth one is the fact of ego. Remember, after Jacob dies, Joseph tells his brothers, I'll take care of you. I'll feed you. I'll make sure everything's okay. I thought God made sure everything was okay and took care of everything. Well, there's a lot of stuff that I did not get to today. As you can see, each parsha is full. I just picked a couple spots to give you some understanding of what's going on. But as you go back and read through this, and we'll go back through it again next year, we'll find more things that we didn't know about or ideas we had no understanding of. So at this point, I'd like to say shalom. See you next week.